Pope Leo XIV stopped the archivist's hand just before a worn wooden rosary disappeared into a gray evidence envelope. The rosary belonged to an 82-year-old American woman behind the security rail. One bead had split. Faded blue thread held it together. "I am sorry," the woman said. "I did not mean to touch anything." The guard explained that she had crossed the rail after being refused access to a restricted cabinet. Visitors were not permitted to bring personal objects near uncatalogued records. The woman lowered her eyes. "I only wanted proof my mother was not a liar." The corridor changed. Pope Leo XIV took the rosary from the envelope and placed it back in her palm. Then he asked her name. "Helen Hale." "My mother was Margaret Hale." At the far end of the corridor, workers were mounting Cardinal Adrian Vale's portrait for a ceremony in 78 minutes. The restored archive room would be named in his honor. Helen had flown from Pennsylvania carrying an index entry for a letter sent by her dying mother 43 years earlier. Beside Margaret Hale's name were 4 words: "Do not catalog. Destroy after response." The archive director, Monsignor Luca Ferretti, spoke with practiced patience. "The index contains many clerical notations," he said. "A notation does not prove a letter survived." Helen nodded as though she had heard that sentence all her life. "My mother said she wrote about money meant for widows. She said someone in Rome would read it. After she died, people said the medicine had confused her. She did not accuse anyone. She did not raise her voice. She simply rubbed the repaired bead with her thumb until the blue thread tightened against her skin." Pope Leo XIV looked toward the portrait, being prepared for the unveiling. Who answered her? Ferretti hesitated. The response carried the signature of Father Adrian Vale. He was a junior official then. The workers stopped hammering. The ceremony would begin in 76 minutes. The Pope asked to see the cabinet. Ferretti explained that the room had already been cleared for renovation. Duplicate files and uncatalogued fragments were being transferred that morning. Once sealed, the boxes would remain unavailable for years. "The process has been approved," he said. "The ceremony must be protected from disruption." The Pope looked at Helen. "What did your mother ask for?" Helen swallowed. "She asked them to read 47 names. No one in the corridor knew whose names they were." Pope Leo XIV turned back to the archive director. "Open the room." The cabinet stood behind a temporary wall of plastic sheeting. Dust covered the floor where shelves had been removed. Ferretti unlocked a steel door and led the Pope, Helen, and 2 archivists inside. The file number from Helen's copy led to an empty space between 2 boxes. The index card remained. The letter did not. Ferretti seemed almost relieved. "As I said, Holy Father, private grief cannot govern the record." It was a polished sentence. It sounded careful. It also sounded practiced. Pope Leo XIV asked for every document filed on the same day. A young archivist brought 3 bundles tied with cotton tape. The first contained routine requests. The second contained parish reports. The third held complaints from a charitable fund established for elderly widows in American industrial towns. Most were marked with the same red pencil. Emotional appeal. No action. Helen leaned closer, but did not touch the pages. When the steel mills in Margaret's town closed, the parish created the Family Mercy Fund to cover heating bills, medicine, and funeral costs for elderly widows. The records showed that 312 women had applied. Only 19 received help. During those years, the same fund financed a retreat house outside Rome for clergy and donors. Ferretti adjusted his glasses. The funds were consolidated. It was considered a strategic investment. For whom? The Pope asked. Ferretti did not answer. A second archivist found a thin carbon copy wedged behind the backing board of another file. The first page began with Margaret Hale's name. The paper was so faint that Helen could not read it without leaning beneath the lamp. Margaret had written from a bedroom in Pennsylvania while cancer moved through her body. She stated that she had cooked for parish events, cleaned the church after funerals, and helped collect donations for the Widows' Fund. She did not ask for money for herself. She asked why women she knew were choosing between heat and medicine, while photographs of the new retreat house appeared in church newsletters. The second page listed dates. The third page listed names. The fourth page had been cut away. Helen touched the edge where it was missing. My mother said the last page mattered most. Ferretti said damaged correspondence was common. Then the Pope noticed a small line at the bottom of the third page. The writer's enclosed rosary is to be returned without acknowledgement. Pope Leo XIV looked at the blue thread around the broken bead. Returned by whom? Helen opened her handbag and removed an old envelope. There was no letter inside. Only a Vatican postmark and the name of the official who had mailed it. Adrian Vale. The ceremony would begin in 52 minutes. Cardinal Vale waited above the audience hall, dressed for the tribute. At 91, he remained courteous, alert, and quietly intimidating. When Pope Leo XIV placed the carbon copy before him, Vale did not pretend to be surprised. "I wondered whether that file would remain buried," he said. Why was the letter removed? Vale folded his hands. The Church cannot be governed by private grief. It was the same sentence Ferretti had used. Vale explained that Margaret Hale had been dying. Her accusations had not been properly verified. Publishing them would have damaged trust in a fund that supported many good works. 19 widows received help, the Pope said. Many more benefited indirectly. Did Margaret? Vale's eyes moved to the rosary. For the first time, his composure weakened. Pope Leo XIV lifted it by the repaired bead. Why did she send you this? Vale said nothing. The Pope turned the small medal attached to the chain. Beneath years of wear were 2 scratched initials. A V. Helen stared at them. Vale reached for the arm of his chair and missed it. The rosary had never belonged to Margaret Hale. It had belonged to him. Margaret Hale had known Adrian Vale before Rome and before anyone stood when he entered a room. He had been a thin seminarian with one good suit and a father lost in a factory accident. Margaret noticed him wrapping leftover bread after parish dinners and invited him into her kitchen. She called it extra food, never charity. When the cord of his rosary broke, she repaired it with blue sewing thread. When he left for Rome, she pressed it into his hand and told him that a priest should never become too important to remember a kitchen table. Vale had carried it for years. Then the Family Mercy Fund came under his supervision. The retreat house began as a modest refuge for exhausted priests. Donors demanded something grander. Vale approved the transfer, telling himself an impressive house would attract gifts that could later help thousands. But the later help never came. The building acquired marble floors. The widows acquired rejection letters. A parish bookkeeper showed Margaret the transfer. Too sick to travel, she wrote to the one man in Rome she believed would listen, the man whose rosary she had repaired. Helen listened without moving. For 43 years, she had wondered why her mother sent away an object she touched every night. She was giving it back to him, Helen said. She wanted him to remember who he had been. Vale looked toward the covered window. She wanted to shame me. No, Helen said. My mother defended you until the day she died. That was the sentence that broke his certainty. Helen remembered that even in her final week, Margaret corrected anyone who criticized Father Vale. He is far away, she had said. He may not know. Margaret believed distance was the problem. She did not know distance had become his protection. A retired translator named Sister Beatrice was brought from the convent infirmary. She had worked in the correspondence office as a young nun. Her hands shook when she saw the carbon copy, but her memory did not. She had typed the internal summary. She had also watched Father Vale remove the final page. He told me the woman was confused, Beatrice said. He said the page contained names that could injure innocent men. What did you do? The Pope asked. I copied it. Vale closed his eyes. Beatrice had hidden the copy inside the back cover of an old Marian prayer book because she feared the original would be destroyed. Years later, the book had been transferred to the same archive room now being renovated. The prayer book was found in a box already sealed for removal. Inside its back cover was a page folded into quarters. Margaret's final page named the officials, the parishes, and women who had sold wedding rings or skipped medicine, while the retreat house welcomed donors beneath crystal lights. But the final paragraph was not an accusation. It was a warning. Margaret wrote that a day would come when families could speak across oceans in an instant, yet mothers would sit beside silent telephones. She wrote that churches might grow more polished, while old women became easier to overlook. She wrote that the church would not be judged by the buildings it protected, but by the people it allowed to disappear beneath them. Then she asked that 47 names be read aloud. Not to create a scandal, to prove those women had existed. At the bottom, in weaker handwriting, Margaret added one private sentence for Helen. Tell my daughter she did not fail me. She came every time she could. Helen covered her mouth. She had carried the opposite belief for most of her life. A winter storm had grounded Helen's flight on her mother's final night. She had built 43 years of guilt around a room she could not reach. Her mother's last surviving words had released her from it. If this brings to mind a mother whose sacrifice was overlooked, write her name in the comments and let her be remembered. Sister Beatrice then revealed something worse. Margaret's letter had not been the only one removed. The red markings led to appeals from all 47 widows. Their accounts of cold houses, unpaid medicine, and delayed funerals had been reduced to one paragraph: repetitive emotional correspondence. The injustice was not a mistake. It was a system built to make suffering look like paperwork. Vale spoke quietly. I believed the house would strengthen the church. Pope Leo XIV placed the rosary on the table. And when did the women become part of the church again? Vale had no answer. From below came the sound of chairs being arranged in the audience hall. Guests had begun to arrive. In 21 minutes, Vale's portrait would be unveiled beside a bronze plaque praising his stewardship of charitable institutions. Ferretti asked whether the ceremony should be postponed. The Pope looked at the list of 47 names. No. Vale looked up, almost hopeful. Pope Leo XIV folded Margaret's final page and handed it to him. The ceremony will begin on time. Then he gave 3 instructions. Leave the portrait covered. Bring 47 chairs. And place Helen Hale in the first one. The audience hall was full when Pope Leo XIV entered. Valley sat beneath the covered portrait while donors held programs praising the retreat house. Then ushers carried in 47 plain wooden chairs. They placed them across the front of the hall, facing the stage. A small white card rested on each seat. Every card carried a woman's name. The room did not understand at first. Helen was led to the first chair. She tried to stop near the aisle, embarrassed by the attention. "I can sit in the back," she whispered. Pope Leo XIV moved the chair himself. "No. Your mother waited there long enough." He placed it beside his own. The program began without music. There was no unveiling, no tribute film, no speech about service. Instead, the Pope held up the repaired rosary. "Cardinal Vale, who taught you to pray with this?" Vale looked at Helen. "Margaret Hale. Who fed you when you had no money?" "Margaret Hale. Who trusted you with the widow's fund?" Vale's voice dropped. "Margaret Hale." The Pope asked the final question. "Then why did you erase her?" Vale repeated the sentence that had protected him for 4 decades. The Church cannot be governed by private grief. Pope Leo XIV looked across the 47 empty chairs. This was not private grief. It was public abandonment. No one moved. Vale had not stolen for personal luxury. He had believed prestige could produce future mercy. When that promise failed, he protected the institution, his reputation, and the story he told himself. Margaret's letter threatened all 3. Vale rose slowly. He could have defended the approvals. He could have blamed the committee, the donors, or the financial customs of another era. Every document gave him someone to hide behind. Instead, he picked up the rosary. The blue thread pressed into his fingers. "She wrote to me because she believed I was still the boy at her table," he said. "I returned the rosary because I did not want to remember that boy." Helen looked at him for a long time. "Mother said you would remember." Vale unfolded the final page. His first attempt to speak failed. Then, before the people gathered to honor him, he began to read the names. Margaret Hale, Evelyn Brooks, Ruth Delgado, Mary Whitcomb. One by one, the women returned to the room. They had raised children, buried husbands, scrubbed parish floors, and filled donation envelopes with money they could not spare. None had been important enough for a portrait. Now every name was spoken before the covered image of the man who had helped erase them. By the 7th name, Vale stopped looking at the page and looked at the empty chairs. By the 20th, donors had lowered their programs. By the 33rd, Ferretti removed his glasses and placed them in his pocket. By the 47th, the hall was silent enough to hear the repaired bead click against Vale's ring. Pope Leo XIV then read Margaret's warning. He did not raise his voice. He read the line about silent telephones. He read the line about polished churches. He read the line about buildings protected while people disappeared beneath them. Older women in the hall looked toward one another. Several reached for phones, not to take photographs, but to call someone after the ceremony. Then the Pope announced what would happen. The portrait would not be unveiled. The archive room would not carry Vale's name. Every suppressed appeal connected to the Family Mercy Fund would be reopened and entered into the permanent record. The families of the 47 women would be contacted where possible. The names would no longer sit inside a box marked emotional correspondence. The retreat house would also change. Its suites would shelter elderly women receiving treatment and families caring for dying parents. Its endowment would be rebuilt through the sale of ceremonial furnishings and restitutions that had benefited. The new house would be named for no cardinal. It would be called the House of the Remembered Mothers. Vale removed the medal from around his neck. "I will resign the honor attached to today's ceremony," he said. The Pope answered him plainly. Resignation is not restitution. Vale looked at the empty chairs. "What must I do?" "You will help restore every name you reduced to a file." Vale would work under supervision to identify suppressed petitions and write personal acknowledgments to surviving families. Not explanations. Acknowledgments. Helen asked for only one thing. She wanted her mother's letter returned to the archive, complete and uncensored. Ferretti said private correspondence required restrictions. Pope Leo XIV looked at him. "The record has been protected from her long enough." Helen signed permission for the letter to be preserved. The first 3 pages, the hidden final page, and the empty envelope that had returned the rosary were placed together. Before the ceremony ended, Vale approached Helen. He did not ask forgiveness in front of the room. That would have placed another burden on her. He held out the rosary. This was hers in every way that mattered, he said. Helen closed his fingers around it. No. She sent it back for a reason. Vale began to protest. Helen shook her head. "She wanted you to remember the kitchen table." For the first time that morning, Vale looked old. Not powerful. Not honored. Just old. He held the rosary with both hands. Pope Leo XIV then walked to Margaret's chair and read the private sentence written for Helen. "Tell my daughter she did not fail me. She came every time she could." Helen did not collapse or cry out. She folded the program as her mother had folded grocery lists at the kitchen table. After 43 years, her hands finally stopped shaking. That evening, the workers removed the bronze plaque from the archive wall. The next morning, a new catalogue entry appeared where Margaret Hale's record had once been marked for destruction. Margaret Hale. Mother. Witness. Letter preserved in full. The 47 chairs were taken to the retreat house and placed around one long dining table. No chair carried a title. Each carried a woman's name. Cardinal Vale returned to the archive with the wooden rosary in his pocket. Before opening the first suppressed file, he wrapped fresh blue thread around the broken bead. Pope Leo XIV watched from the doorway but did not enter. Some wrongs were corrected with decrees. Others began when a powerful man finally sat down at the table of the woman he had tried to forget. And in the quiet archive, the small blue thread held. so did her name.